The Amiga 1200 has always been one of my favourite computers of all time. In fact, I've still got really vivid memories of the first time I ever saw one in my local computer shop, long before I'd read about them in any magazines or anything like that, and originally thinking, what is that elongated Amiga 600? And then, of course, I read all the magazine reviews shortly after, learned about the new AGA graphics chipset, the faster 020 processor that, with a little bit of fast RAM, could actually make this machine 5 times faster than my current Amiga 500. I knew right then that I had to have one. And I got my Amiga 1200 a year later. In fact, it was just a few months before Commodore went bust in April of 1994, but I did keep using it as my main machine until around Windows XP's release in 2001. So it really was testament to just how powerful and expandable the Amiga 1200 was that I was able to use it as my daily computer for pretty much a decade. And I know there will be those who are quick to point out that a spec'd out 486 with a 24-bit graphics card and a sound blaster was already outperforming the Amiga 1200 as soon as it was released, and even the Atari Falcon has got its fans. But for a £399 machine that could replace my Amiga 500, I thought the A1200 was great, and it turned out to be way more expandable than the designers ever planned it to be. The price difference between the low-end Amiga 1200 and the top-end Amiga 4000 was huge, at £399 and £2,000 respectively. And you could actually expand the Amiga 1200 to be a machine just as powerful, if not more so, than the Amiga 4000. And I remember people transplanting the motherboards into tower cases and adding all manner of expansions to ports that were never intended to be used like that, like the clock port, and adding things like Zorro slots and PowerPC accelerators. So the Amiga 1200 has always been a surprisingly expandable machine. Today, a lot of the classic Amiga accelerators fetch big money if you manage to track one down on eBay, and apart from cards like the Vampire, it's kind of felt like most recent Amiga accelerators have focused a bit more on the lower to mid-end kind of range, with 68030 accelerator cards and a bit of extra RAM, which are great for increasing performance on a few games, but not quite the powerhouses that we had in the past. But that's about to change, and today we're going to be having a look at a new device that brings top-end classic Amiga performance back to the Amiga 1200 and very soon the A500 thanks to CS Lab. The Warp 1260 is a new all-in-one device that brings some big upgrades to your stock Amiga 1200. And inside this innocent-looking white box lies an expansion that I could have only dreamt about as a teenager. So let's have a look what's in here. So first we've got a plastic bag containing the cooling fan and an audio splitter cable, more on that later. And here is the main event, the powerhouse that is the Warp 1260. And if we look at the back of the very nicely designed box, I've got to say, we can see a full list of specs and features contained on this trapdoor expansion for the Amiga 1200. On there we've got a Motorola 68060 CPU running at up to 105 MHz, 256 MB of DDR3, 800 MB RAM. We've got built-in RTG graphics, meaning that you can get full 1080p 32-bit color displays over HDMI out of this. We've got a 16-bit audio codec with a 24-bit sampler, a fast IDE connection, Wi-Fi module, an ARM coprocessor that we'll talk more about a bit later on, SD card support, hardware Jpeg and Mp3 decoding, and it's even got onboard USB. Now, a lot of these features were just not possible several years ago on a desktop Amiga 1200. Back then, to get this kind of expandability, you needed to tower your system and add a lot of very expensive separate add-on cards. And looking inside the box itself, we get a CS Lab sticker, very important. We've got the HDMI and USB hub that will fit in just a bit. A few little cables. A pen, that's very handy. The Wi-Fi antenna. And in here is the Warp itself. Now this one is fitted with the Motorola 68060 revision 6 that is under this massive custom heatsink, and it is actually a really nice design as the Amiga 1200 keyboard will fit nicely above this with no obstruction. And I just want to say a big thank you to the guys from CS Labs for supplying me with this 060. The retail units, you're probably going to have to supply your own chips, as they can be quite hard to source these days. But there are guys like John Hurtle who often sell these to the Amiga community, but you just got to be aware of buying fake clones on eBay for unrealistically cheap prices. If you need a hand tracking one down, leave me a comment and I'll do my best to give you a hand. And on here we can see the IDE connector with a compact flash card and adapter installed. Next to that we've got the audio connector, and there's a scan doubler input on here as well. Now I did ask the guys at CS Labs if it was compatible with the Indivision AGA, and unfortunately it isn't, but they're working on their own scan doubler, which will be a separate product that you can install. So I'll talk more about why you'll probably want to get one of those very soon, but hopefully it won't be too long until they release that. We've also got a micro SD card slot on here as well. And on the back of the card, we've got even more exciting things to explore. We've got the ARM coprocessor running at 480 MHz. Next to that, you can see the DDR3 RAM. We've got a Wi-Fi chip. Also, the USB headers are on the side of it as well, with the HDMI output and an expansion connector, and a connector for the battery to keep the Amiga's real-time clock saved when you power off the machine. So fitting the card should be pretty straightforward. All I need to do is flip my A1200 around, and as you can see from here, I've already got an expansion in the trapdoor, which is just a simple 68030 accelerator with 64 megabytes of RAM and a clock battery. And the Warp 1260 is physically a bigger card than the ACA 1230 that I had in there previously, so it's not going to be possible to fit it properly without opening the Amiga up. And besides, there are other things that we need to fit inside the case, so we will need to open the machine up. So after we remove the screws, we need to take the keyboard out, and I've also got a IDE hard disk, just kind of loose it here as well, that I've wrapped with insulating tape so it doesn't short out. The reason is I couldn't use a bracket when I had other expansions in here before it wouldn't fit. And of course the ACA 1230 needs to come out as well. And while we're here, we'll also remove the floppy drive, as I'm going to need access to the expansion area underneath it, which actually, at the moment, has already got a DVI connector in there. Now, I did mention before that I used to have an Indivision AGA scan doubler in there. I did a video on that a few years ago. I removed that recently and never got round to taking the DVI port out, so we'll just do that quickly now. And now, the A1200 is ready to receive the Warp 1260. Now, fitting the card is actually pretty simple. It just goes up through the trapdoor hole, and then you need to line it up with the edge connector. Now, I do say this is easy in theory. It's not quite so easy when you're leaning around a camera and lights. So yeah, a quick cut here while I put it on my knee and push it into place. And after I've done that, you can see it is a nice snug fit. And the next thing to fit is the USB and HDMI Connector Hub. Now this is 3D printed plastic that just pushes into place into the back of the Amiga, and it is a very tight fit and requires quite a bit of force to push in, and then you can screw that into place afterwards. And then you just need to plug the other ends of the cables into the ports on the Warp 1260. Again, a bit fiddly to do on camera, but I got there in the end. And I'll also attach the clock battery as well, which is just on this small wire, insulated so it can be placed loose inside the case, and then it means your Amiga 1200 can keep the correct time when it's powered off. And obviously cramming all of this extra power into the slim Amiga 1200 case is going to increase the heat inside the machine, particularly if you're running this at the top speed of 105 MHz. The Amiga 1200 slim case just wasn't designed with much cooling in mind. But luckily, the Warp guys have come up with a solution, and it's actually a pretty neat idea of fitting a fan into the Amiga 1200 desktop case. But I did find that this was the most tricky part of the entire installation for me. The idea is that this fan sits over the Amiga's floppy and keyboard connectors, acting as a pass-through, but also taking the 5 volts power to it from the Amiga's floppy connector. But the fit of it is actually really tight up against the floppy drive. I do know that some Amiga 1200 drives have got the data and power cables at the opposite ends compared to mine, which might be a factor, but it took me about 50 minutes to get this fitted properly without popping off, and really that was just by sheer luck, as I couldn't see what I was doing. When it was fitted though, it works just fine, and then you connect the Amiga's floppy power cable and the keyboard connector plug to the top of the fan. And we also get this audio combination cable, which will mix the Amiga's Paula audio with the ARM output from the Warp 1260. Now you can do a more permanent solution by soldering the cables inside your Amiga, and the guys from CS Labs have actually put together a really handy guide on how to do that, but for now, we'll just use the cables trailing out of the bottom of my Amiga. And then we fit the Wi-Fi antenna to the corner of the chip. There's a small UFL connector that just pushes over. And then all we need to do is hook up an HDMI cable and we should be good to go. Now I always do a quick power on and test before putting the case back together, just in case I've done something wrong and it needs to all come apart again. And I'm using a PC power supply from Amiga Kit. Now this is modded for the Amiga, but it means we've got plenty of power to run the system and expansions, although it's not a requirement. And there we have it, it booted just fine into a very nice high-res Amiga workbench. And at this stage, I didn't have a mouse connected, so I thought I'd just quickly pull the Apple Mighty Mouse from my Mac behind it and try plugging it into the Warp's USB port on the off chance that it would work. And I was pretty surprised to see that it did. No drivers needed, it just worked straight away, which is really cool. And if we run a basic system information tool, which Amiga, it shows that we've got a Motorola 68060 running at 50 MHz, and it also identifies it as a Revision 6 chip with an FPU and an MMU on board. We can see the AJ chipset, the Picasso 96, which is the RTG system that gives that really high color and high resolution graphics, and it correctly identifies the machine as an Amiga 1200, admittedly a very souped up one. And we'll just quickly set the correct date and time while we're in here as well, as at the moment the system thinks it's 1978. So if we just do that quickly and then we click on save, that will be backed up by the battery now. Now 50 MHz is a nice speed boost over the 14 MHz 020, but let's try bumping the speed up a bit, shall we? Now there are some tools included to easily set things up like the CPU speed and the fans, all controlled via software. Running this program here called Warp Diag lets me set the CPU to lots of different speeds, but let's just ramp it right up to its maximum of 105 MHz. And since doing that will make the chip run hotter, let's put the fan to work as well on maximum setting. And upon doing that I can hear a very slight fan hum coming from the Amiga 1200, but it's not too loud at all. We can also see the mouse identified has been connected to the USB hub, and we can change the mouse pointer speed in here as well. We can even select ROMs in here too. We'll stick with 3.1.4 for now, and give the system a reboot so the new settings come into effect. And then, if we run Which Amiga again, you can see that the CPU is now identified as running at 105 MHz, so it looks like we are set at full speed. Now at the moment I'm running the original firmware that the guys supplied at CS Labs, but actually it's really easy to update it. They bring out new revisions of the firmware. All you have to do is download it to a USB stick, insert that into the Amiga, power off and power on, and then the ARM chip will kick in and it will actually update the firmware on the FPGA on board. So that means it's really simple to do upgrades in place, and eventually they're going to have this working over Wi-Fi as well. Now I did mention the lack of a onboard scan doubler, and this Samsung monitor is actually particularly choosy about screen modes. It will display 1080 and 720 just fine, but anything else gives me an out of range error. Plus, if you want to run classic Amiga games and demos that are not intended for RTG, at the moment you're going to need a second display or a monitor that will also accept 15 kHz PAL and NTSC signals and has got both HDMI and RGB SCART or maybe composite input that'd work too. And then if you open any programs that are hard-coded to use the Amiga's native chipset, they're going to output the video via the Amiga's RGB port. Now this is a little bit annoying to rely on two different screens, but that's just the design of the Amiga. They were intended mainly to be used with RGB monitors or televisions. Now to get around this, you need a device called a scan doubler, which increases the frequency of the Amiga's native screen modes, so displays that expect higher signals can then display them. Now like I mentioned, I did have the Indivision AGA fitted in this machine that I did a video on a few years ago. Unfortunately, as mentioned, the Warp 1260 is not compatible with it, but the team are going to be bringing out their own scan doubler that will be released soon, allowing you then to display everything via the HDMI connector, meaning that you'll only need one monitor for everything. So now we've got this working, beefed up to the maximum Amiga 1200, what can we actually do with it? Well, of course, we've got access to much more screen resolution and more colours than the standard setup, and everything, of course, is really responsive. And that means you can run all your favourite classic applications, a lot of them in higher screen modes, and they perform and look really good. But what about the games? That's what you want to see. So I know the question that's going to be asked in the comments, can it run Crysis? Well, no, of course not, but it can run Doom. And whenever you see a demo of an Amiga accelerator or a graphics card, you nearly always see Doom being proudly displayed. And if you're not a big Amiga fan, you might be thinking, well, what is so special about running a 25-year-old PC game? Obviously, Doom is on pretty much everything today, but Amiga fans do run Doom as a bit of a badge of honour, simply because when Doom was new, we were told that it couldn't be done by none other than John Carmack from id Software himself. In a reply to an email from 1994, he said, "The Amiga is not powerful enough to run Doom. It takes the full speed of a 68040 to play the game properly, even if you had chunky pixel mode in hardware. Having to convert this to bit planes would kill it even on the fastest Amiga hardware, not to mention the effect it would have on the majority of the Amiga base." Of course, the Amiga community saw that as a challenge, and sure enough, a few years later, when it was open sourced, Doom was running on the Amiga just fine. But on the Warp 1260, if you want to play old PC FPS games, it also handles Quake at a pretty playable frame rate as well. And there is also a recent Amiga port of Diablo that runs great on here. But for me, if I want to play these games, I can use a dumpster dive PC or a Raspberry Pi or something. I can see that from a technical achievement, running these on the Amiga is cool, it's quirky, and something you never thought you'd see when these games were new, but I want to run Amiga software. So let's try out a few of the more demanding later Amiga games. Payback was released in 2001, and it was a very successful attempt to make a Grand Theft Auto clone for expanded Amigas. Now, it was also released a few years later on the Game Boy Advance and then the iPhone and the Mac, but the Amiga version was the original, and as you can see, it runs really nicely on this setup. And the game itself is lots of fun to play. I'd highly recommend giving it a download if you've not played it before. And we've got Napalm, The Crimson Crisis. Now, this is an RTS game that was released in 1998, and it needs pretty high specs to run. Now, this game crawls on a standard Amiga 1200, but as you can see, even though RTS games are not my preferred genre, and I haven't really got any idea what I'm doing, it does run nicely on this setup. The display is a little bit flickery in parts, but otherwise, it plays great and at a really decent frame rate. And Nightlong is so good. This is another later Amiga game that a lot of people probably haven't tried, as it came out in the year 2000 by Clickboom, and it's a really atmospheric cyberpunk adventure game. And again, this was designed for really high-end Amigas. Now, it's really optimized for PowerPC accelerators, and as you can see, even with the 060 and the RTG, the frame rate of the animations is still a bit janky, but the game itself is actually totally playable and runs really smoothly. Now, this one admittedly was a PC port, but it was also released commercially very late on in the Amiga's life as a commercial game. The Amiga has native first-person shooter games as well. Gloom was one of my favourites back in the day, and I used to play this on a standard Amiga CD32 console, and even at this low frame rate, really pixely blocky graphics, it was still lots of fun to play. But in RTG, with an 060, we can run Gloom Deluxe, and this runs beautifully with no slowdown. Everything looks nice and high res, and it is a really fluid experience. And it's the same with the third game, Gloom 3 Zombie Edition. And I want to give a shout to Gaz Murfin from Alpha Software, who was behind this game, as I know Gaz sometimes watches the channel. And this is Breathless. Now, I've got this game running in AGA mode via the Amiga standard RGB graphics, and I want to show you that even using AGA, having the 060 in here will still give a decent speed boost to the more demanding Amiga games like this. And the daddy of high-end Amiga FPS games is the famous Alien Breed 3D 2. The Killing Grounds. Now, this was an Amiga exclusive that came out in 1996 by Team 17, and it was an attempt to do a Quake-style game for the Amiga, but it was really, really ambitious. And to be fair, hardly any Amigas at the time could run this game at a decent speed, even ones with accelerators and lots of RAM. But if we had the Warp 1260 on our Amiga 1200s back in 1996, we could have played this game in all its glory, and it actually runs really nicely on here. we just had to wait 24 years. As well as games, having the Warp 1260 also opens the door to the small but impressive high-end Amiga demo scene. Now, there are demos that are made especially for 060-based machines, like this one, the awesome Starstruck by the Black Lotus. Now, this came out in 2006, and it was released for Amigas and Atari Falcon machines, equipped with 060 accelerators, and generally, this is considered the best 060 demo on both platforms, and it's got some jaw-dropping effects in here. And possibly even more niche than the 060 demos, we've got ones that are made for 060s and RTG displays that of course we can display on here as well. So as you can see, it runs high-end games and demos very nicely, but having the 060 in here also makes the world of emulation a much more viable option. Now, the Amiga's always been very good at emulating the classic 68K Mac, and of course having a 105 MHz 060 in here, this makes this machine the fastest classic Mac around. And using the Shapeshifter emulator, we can boot directly into classic Mac OS and run games and demos at full speed. And of course this means we can play some games that were never actually released on the Amiga, or have superior versions on the Mac, like the very nice Mac port of Prince of Persia. Now, this came out later than the Amiga version and has got some much nicer graphics. And I would have loved to have Alone in the Dark on the Amiga back in the day. And I did mention that there is a 480 MHz ARM coprocessor on board as well, which at the moment we can use for Mp3 decoding, meaning that you can listen to MP3 files on your Amiga. Now, at the moment, support is just implemented in the command line. It's only really just been done, but you can store MP3 files on a USB stick and explore the contents of them using the Warp Tool software. And we can see that I've got an MP3 directory. And if we look in there, I've got a song from the brilliant Retro Grooves Volume 3 that I'll link in the video description. And using the Amiga's command line, we can play it from here, and the ARM chip will start streaming the file. And we can continue using the Amiga while it's playing without any slowdown at all. And of course it's only just been introduced, and this whole experience will become a lot easier, and it will be supported with like Amiga AMP and software like that in the future. But as you can see, it's all working already. So a few questions I know will be asked in the comments. So first of all, how much is the card and when can you get hold of it? Well, the card is not cheap. It's going to sell at €499 without the 060 chip. Now, I've been chatting to the team and they do have a few 060s in stock, but not many of them. So really, it's going to be down to you to source your own. And it is expensive, but when you consider exactly what you're getting and how much the alternatives would cost you if you want to run real hardware, not emulation, this is actually decent value for such an expansion, and the team are going to be putting order information on their website, which I'll link up in the video description, amigawarp.eu, very soon. And being that I've got a pre-release model of it, it is still in beta, so some things like USB and the micro SD card slot on the Wi-Fi are not supported by Amiga OS at the moment, but that is coming. So that means it will be possible to put a USB stick in or have a micro SD card mounted and read the contents on Workbench and use it for file copying and as a standard disk or even boot from them. And the Wi-Fi will be used to get the Amiga online, and they're actually working on doing this at the socket level using the BSD socket library, so you won't need a separate stack like Roadshow or Miami Deluxe, anything like that. And they're also working on a version for the Amiga 500, which is amazing. And if I do manage to get my hands on one of those cards, I will of course do a full video on that in the future. And also an Amiga 4000 version, which I'm really excited about, as the Amiga 4000 is my main Amiga. And you know, things like the Vampire haven't been released for the A4000 yet, and I don't know if it ever will happen. So having such an expansion in there would just be incredible. So in conclusion, I think this is a fantastic bit of kit. Everything about it is just pure quality, from the build, the packaging, even the beta software support. At the moment it's rock solid even at this stage, and the team are fully committed to evolving this into the ultimate classic Amiga expansion. And having an 060 accelerator in my Amiga 1200 was always a dream back in the day. So to get one with RTG, graphics, MP3 decoding, USB, onboard Wi-Fi, all in one simple to fit expansion is just incredible. And sure, it is a niche product, and yes, it's expensive, but if you want an Amiga 1200 expanded to its absolute limit, then this card is worth every penny. And to be honest, it's just amazing that expansions like this are being made for the Amiga in 2020. So if you've got any questions, please do leave a comment and I'll try my best to answer them, or I will direct them to the team at CS Labs. And if you enjoy my videos here on YouTube, I also do a weekly retro gaming podcast. Now, actually, we had David Pleasance and Trevor Dickinson talking about what happened to the Amiga after Commodore to promote a new book that they're working on together at the moment recently. We've had Violet Berlin from Bad Influence on there, the making of Prince of Persia with Jordan Mechner, and you can check out all of those on your favourite podcast app, search for The Retro Hour, or download it directly from our website at theretrohour.com. And while you're here on YouTube, here's another one of my videos you might enjoy. And if you'd like to see me do more videos like this, please consider supporting my channel on Patreon. I'll see you next time.